Sir, you need to leave this aircraft right now. The words cracked through the first-class cabin so sharply that even the clink of ice in crystal glasses seemed to stop. Heads turned. A baby somewhere in business class let out a thin cry. Near the front galley, under the warm amber lights that made the polished cabin walls glow like expensive wood, a tall flight attendant in a pressed Navy uniform stood blocking the aisle with one arm outstretched. Her name tag read Vanessa Cole, and every inch of her posture said she was used to being obeyed. In front of her sat a quiet man in seat 2A, dressed in a charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and scuffed brown shoes that looked more practical than stylish. No designer watch. No gold chain. No status symbols. Just a worn leather carry-on at his feet and a calm expression on his face that somehow made the tension worse. "I paid for this seat," he said, not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. Vanessa's smile was thin and cold. "Not with that boarding pass, you didn't." Several passengers leaned farther into the aisle, sensing blood in the water the way people always do when they think drama is about to become entertainment. A man across the row raised his phone slightly. A woman near the window whispered, "Oh my God." And what none of them knew, not Vanessa, not the passengers, not even the young gate agent peeking nervously from the galley, was that within 20 minutes, this same plane, this same crew, and this entire airline would be frozen by one name. Before we go any farther, drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever seen someone judged before anyone bothered to learn who they were, hit like and subscribe to Echo Story. Because this one starts with a seat assignment and ends with careers collapsing in real time. But to understand why the cabin went silent when that man finally stood up, you have to go back 43 minutes. To the gate where nobody gave him a second look. The airport had that late evening glow that only major hubs seem to have, where exhaustion and money mix under polished floors and giant glass windows streaked with rain. Flight 718 to New York was boarding through Gate C-19, and the overhead speakers kept repeating soft announcements nobody truly listened to. Travelers dragged roller bags past glossy ads and tired airport workers, and in the middle of all that movement walked the man now sitting in 2A. His name was Elijah Ward. At first glance he looked like the least important person in the priority line. His sweater was plain, his carry-on was old, and he moved without the impatience of people who are used to clearing space just by existing. He had arrived alone, without assistance, without security, without anyone barking into a headset on his behalf. He stood quietly near a pillar, watching the weather bead against the windows, as if the whole airport were just another room passing through him, instead of something designed to rush human beings into stress. Not far from him, a young travel vlogger with a pink phone rig and a clipped Midwestern voice was filming luxury airline boarding hacks for her followers. Across from the gate sat an older black woman in a camel coat, silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, observing everything over folded hands with the alert stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms before rooms could turn dangerous. And behind the counter, half hidden by monitors and printers, a junior operations employee named Maya. Torres was double-checking seat updates while trying not to notice that Vanessa was already in a mood. It had been delays all afternoon. Crews were tense. Passengers were irritable. The storm had thrown off schedules all across the East Coast. Still, when Elijah stepped forward and offered his boarding pass with a simple "good evening," there was nothing. Dramatic in the moment, nothing. Yet that would tell anyone they were watching the beginning of a disaster built on arrogance. Maya scanned the pass and saw the green clearance flash. C2, confirmed, but before she could wave him through, Vanessa, who had just come up from the jet bridge with the kind of restless authority that always wants a target, reached over, looked at the screen, looked at Elijah, and frowned like the system itself had insulted her. Vanessa took the boarding pass between two fingers as though she were handling something suspicious. "Hold on," she said, eyes narrowing. The tone was subtle, but everyone in earshot felt it, the shift from routine to challenge. Elijah waited. Not defensive. Not confused. Just waiting. Maya glanced from the scanner to the manifest again. It's valid, she murmured, but Vanessa didn't respond. She was studying Elijah's face now, then his shoes, then the old leather carry-on with the frayed handle. Behind him, members of the priority boarding group shuffled impatiently. A hedge fund-looking man in a navy blazer checked his watch with theatrical annoyance. The vlogger angled her phone slightly closer. Vanessa tapped the screen. This seat was flagged for a last-minute VIP accommodation, she said. Are you sure you're at the right gate? It was the kind of question that sounds polite on paper and humiliating in person. Elijah met her gaze. I'm sure. His voice was steady enough to irritate her more than anger would have. Maya swallowed. The system did not show any flag. No reassignment. No problem. Vanessa knew that too, but something in her had already made a decision based on the oldest lazy formula in the world. Plain clothes. Quiet manner, no visible status. Let me see some additional identification, she said. A few people in line looked up now, sensing that this was no longer about a scanner glitch. Elijah handed over his ID without argument. Vanessa glanced at the name, and for a fraction of a second there was something almost like recognition, then it vanished behind performance. She turned the card over. Do you have another one? That one should be enough, sir. I asked for another one. The older woman in the camel coat shifted slightly in her seat. Maya felt the air tighten. Elijah reached into his wallet and produced a second ID card, darker, heavier, corporate. Vanessa barely looked at it before handing it back. Step aside, she said. We need to verify something. And there it was, the public part. Not a private check. Not a discreet aside. Step aside. In front of everyone. A soft hush moved through the line. Elijah stepped to the side without protest, which somehow made the humiliation more visible. The vlogger whispered to her camera, Okay. This just got weird. Maya wanted to speak. Wanted to say the seat was confirmed and the system was clean, but Vanessa had seniority, and years of working under people like her had trained hesitation into everyone around her. Elijah simply set his bag by the pillar and waited as if time belonged to him and not to the woman trying to use it against him. There are people who respond to public disrespect by filling the space with noise. And then there are people who go still because they learned long ago that stillness unnerves the guilty more than shouting ever can. Elijah belonged to the second kind, but that calm had not been born in comfort. 15 years earlier he had stood in a freezing warehouse office in Cleveland, wearing a borrowed coat and explaining to a bank manager why his freight software startup deserved one more extension before the creditors took everything. He had watched men in expensive suits speak around him as if he were furniture. He had seen the way doors close when people decide too quickly what your clothes mean. Back then he had almost lost his company because he'd wasted precious energy reacting to insult instead of mastering it. The lesson cost him sleep, money, and nearly his mother's house, which he had refinanced in desperation. He never forgot it. So now, under the airport lights, while Vanessa made a show of calling someone who did not need to be called, Elijah stood with his hands loosely folded and his expression unreadable. The rain beyond the windows traced silver lines down the glass. The gate speaker chirped another boarding announcement. A little boy near the carpet edge tugged on his father's sleeve and asked, too loudly, "Why can't that man get on?" Nobody answered. The older woman in the camel coat watched Elijah the way older people sometimes do when they recognize discipline in someone. Younger and know it was paid for dearly. The vlogger, whose channel lived on stranger confrontations than this, zoomed in just enough to catch Vanessa's clipped smile and the uncomfortable way Maya kept checking the screen. Elijah's phone buzzed once in his coat pocket. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. He ignored that too. "Sir," Vanessa said, coming back with a paper-thin confidence reinforced by an audience, "there seems to be an issue with your boarding authorization." Maya's head snapped up. That was false. Elijah looked at her, then at Vanessa. There isn't. It wasn't a challenge. It was a fact. People in line exchanged glances. A few stepped aside to keep watching, and the storm outside deepened. As if the whole airport were gathering itself for a different kind of weather, the first person to openly challenge. The moment was not a man in a suit or an airport official. It was the older woman in the camel coat. She stood slowly, elegant and unhurried, and approached the counter with the measured dignity of someone who did not waste words. "Excuse me," she said to Maya, not Vanessa. "I've been sitting here the whole time. That gentleman hasn't raised his voice, and your system cleared him the first time." Vanessa turned before Maya could answer. "Ma'am, this does not concern you." "It concerns everyone when procedure becomes theater," the woman replied. Her voice was low, but it carried. That sentence changed the room. What had been a spectacle began to look like a pattern. The vlogger, smelling narrative now, whispered, "Oh," she said, "theater," and tilted her phone to catch both faces. Vanessa straightened. "We're simply following policy." "Then perhaps you should cite it," the woman said. Even the hedge fund man with the watch looked up from his irritation for that one. Maya's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could feel herself standing on the edge of something. Elijah, still calm, turned slightly toward the woman. "Thank you," he said. "Just that. No drama. No plea." Vanessa seemed irritated by his composure and by the fact that support for him had emerged from someone she could not dismiss as easily. "Sir," she said, louder now, "if you continue to delay the boarding process, we may have to involve security." That was the pivot from suspicion to accusation, and several people reacted all at once. The little boy's father muttered, "He's literally just standing there." The vlogger's eyebrows lifted. The older woman's mouth tightened. Maya stared at Vanessa in disbelief. Elijah finally removed his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. The incoming messages stacked rapidly, but he locked it again without replying. "I'm not delaying anything," he said. "I'm waiting for you to correct your mistake." It was the first time his words carried even a shadow of steel. Vanessa smiled with a kind of brittle triumph. "There it is," she said. "Aggressive behavior." Maya actually inhaled in shock. The older woman took one step forward. "No," she said, "what that is a man describing reality." More passengers were filming now? The gate area had stopped functioning like a line and started functioning like a jury. And still, Elijah did not move, did not explain, did not reveal who he was. He just watched Vanessa make the kind of choice that feels powerful in the moment and catastrophic once the truth arrives. Maya Torres had worked airline operations for 3 years. Long enough to know the small daily, humiliations that got disguised as checks and holds and discretion. She had also worked long enough to know that the system leaves fingerprints when someone lies through policy. Elijah's boarding pass was not flagged. His ID matched. His seat was clean. The notes section was blank. Vanessa had invented the problem, and now she was trying to force the software to catch up with her prejudice. Maya looked at the screen, then at the gathering crowd, then at Elijah. She saw the way he stood, not defeated, not pleading, not performative. She saw something else too, every few seconds. Operations messages were hitting the internal dashboard from corporate scheduling. Marked urgent, though she didn't yet know why. Her heart began to pound. "Vanessa," she said carefully, "maybe we should just rescan." I said, "I'll handle it." Vanessa snapped without taking her eyes off Elijah. That one sentence shoved Maya back into the role every junior employee learns too well. Witness, not actor. But in her chest, the witness had already begun to split. The vlogger wandered close enough that her phone now caught the gate monitor, the line of passengers, and Elijah in profile. "Guys," she murmured for her live stream, "I think this is one of those situations where someone is being singled out for absolutely no reason." Comments started flying across her screen. The older woman stayed near Elijah now, a quiet human shield in a camel coat. And somewhere down the concourse, 2 airport security officers began walking toward Gate C-19, called by someone who wanted obedience more than accuracy. Elijah saw them before anyone else did. A flicker passed through his eyes, not fear, not anger, just a kind of sad recognition. Another flashback touched him then. Quick as breath, his father, standing in front of a hardware store manager 22 years ago, hat in his hands, being accused of causing tension because he'd asked why his paycheck was short. Elijah had been 12. He remembered the lesson settling cold in his stomach that day. Sometimes systems speak softly while humiliating you in public, and if you lose control first, they call it proof. He had spent his whole adult life building a world where men like his father would never have to beg institutions to see them clearly. But you can build empires and still be reduced, in one arrogant stranger's eyes, to your sweater, your shoes, and your silence. The officers drew closer. Vanessa folded her arms. "Now," she said, "we'll get this sorted out properly." And for the first time, several passengers looked less entertained than uneasy, because everyone could feel the line between inconvenience and disgrace being crossed in plain sight. When the security officers arrived, they brought with them the unmistakable shift in atmosphere that uniforms always create in crowded places. Conversations dropped, eyes sharpened. Even the storm-muted airport seemed to lean in. One officer, broad-shouldered and tired-eyed, asked the standard question, "What seems to be the problem?" Vanessa answered before anyone else could. "Passenger is refusing compliance during boarding. Potentially disruptive." It was a lie packaged in procedural language, and because it sounded official, it hit the air with weight. Elijah looked at the officer. "I presented a valid boarding pass," he said. "She denied me access without cause." The second officer, younger and more uncertain, glanced between them. Maya took a breath as if she might finally speak, but then another passenger did it first. "That's true," said the older woman. "I watched the entire thing." The vlogger lifted her phone. "And I've got video." The broad-shouldered officer's expression changed by 1 degree. Not enough to take sides, but enough to register that this was not going to be as simple as Vanessa hoped. "Sir," he said to Elijah, "would you step over here so we can talk?" Elijah picked up his worn carry-on. For a moment, the sight of that old bag in his hand made the scene look even crueler. As though some overworked, ordinary man were about to lose the dignity of travel because someone decided he didn't look expensive enough for first class. As he stepped away, the hedge fund man in line muttered, "This is ridiculous," though whether he meant the delay or the treatment was not entirely clear. The younger officer asked for Elijah's identification again. Elijah handed it over, then quietly added a black card from his wallet. The younger officer looked at it, frowned, and passed it to his partner, who stared 1 second too long before handing it back. "You work with the airline?" he asked. "Something like that," Elijah said. Vanessa gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they think someone is bluffing above their station. "We hear that all the time." Elijah did not respond. Overhead, boarding continued for other groups, but the gate had become a stage nobody could leave. Maya's terminal pinged again, louder this time. An internal operations alert flashed across her screen, this one marked in red. She clicked it. Her breath stopped. The message was brief. "Urgent hold departure, Chairman en route on site, a WIT confirmation." Maya looked up at Elijah as if the floor had shifted under her feet. He was standing with security under the blue-white airport lights, calm as stone. And Vanessa, still confident, still certain, had no idea she was 1 sentence away from stepping in front of the truth at full speed. Maya's pulse thundered in her ears. "Chairman, on site. Await confirmation." She read the alert twice, then a third time, hoping she had misunderstood. Another message followed immediately beneath it from network operations. "All relevant station managers report to Gate C-19 immediately." Her mouth went dry. She clicked open the internal executive profile list with hands that no longer felt steady and typed the name, from the ID she had scanned earlier. Elijah Ward. A headshot appeared older than the man at the gate by a few years, but unmistakably him. Same steady eyes, same reserved mouth. Beneath it, founder and executive chairman, Ward Meridian Holdings. Majority controlling investor, Astera Air Group, their parent company. Not a consultant. Not a partner. Not someone who merely worked with the airline. the man Vanessa had publicly accused, delayed and handed over to security, effectively sat above every regional manager, every terminal director, every polished executive who occasionally swept through airports pretending to understand ground operations. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. Across the counter, Vanessa was saying, if his documentation had been proper, none of this would have happened. Maya looked up sharply. The lie had now become self-defense. She needed to speak. She knew it. But old hierarchies are not broken in one brave thought. They are broken by the moment when staying silent becomes worse than the risk of speaking. The vlogger's chat was exploding now, people demanding updates, guessing at discrimination, telling her to keep filming. The older woman stayed beside Elijah, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her purse, as if lending the scene moral gravity just by refusing to leave it. The broad-shouldered officer asked Vanessa, what exactly is the compliance issue? She hesitated, then improvised, suspicious travel credential irregularity. The younger officer frowned. That's not what the call said. Vanessa opened her mouth to recover, and that was when Maya's chair scraped back. The sound was tiny, but in that stretched moment it felt enormous. She stepped out from behind the desk with a printout trembling slightly in her hand. There is no credential issue, she said. Her voice cracked on the first word, then steadied. Everyone turned. Vanessa stared at her. Maya, get back behind the desk. No, Maya said, and it was the first fully adult word she had said all night. His boarding pass is valid. His seat is confirmed, and corporate operations has placed a hold on departure because... She swallowed. She looked at Elijah, who gave nothing away. Because Mr. Ward is the executive chairman of the company that controls this airline. Silence hit the gate like impact. Then even that silence seemed to freeze. It is a strange thing to watch certainty die on someone's face. Vanessa did not react all at once. First came disbelief, hard and instinctive. Then calculation. Then the rapid, almost desperate search for any fact that might preserve her authority. That's impossible, she said, but the words landed weakly because the room had already shifted away from her. The broad-shouldered officer looked from Maya to Elijah with a new alertness. The younger officer's posture straightened instantly. The older woman in the camel coat closed her eyes for one slow second, not surprised so much as grimly confirmed. The vlogger whispered, "No way," to thousands of viewers at once. Elijah, still holding the old carry-on, finally looked directly at Vanessa. "You wanted another form of identification," he said. Not loud, not theatrical, just precise. It was devastating. Vanessa's composure fractured at the edges. "If there's been some misunderstanding, there has," Elijah said. "But not the kind you think." A ripple of murmurs moved through the waiting area. Passengers leaned inward. Somewhere behind the line a man actually muttered, "Holy hell." Maya handed the printout to the officer, who scanned it and visibly changed. "Mr. Ward," he said, voice immediately respectful, "I apologize." Elijah nodded once. "You don't need to apologize for arriving after the lie," he replied. That sentence cut deeper than any raised voice could have. Vanessa opened her mouth again, but now words were abandoning her at exactly the speed power always does when it learns it has been borrowed, not owned. And yet the story still was not over, not for Elijah, not for Maya, not for everyone filming, and certainly not for the airline. Because hidden power is satisfying, but what makes a story unforgettable is what that power chooses to do next. Elijah could have ended the moment right there with a single threat, a single order, a single name dropped in anger. Instead, he set his old carry-on down gently beside the counter and asked Maya a question no one expected. "Did you tell the truth because I'm chairman?" he said, "or because it was true?" Maya blinked, stunned. "Because it was true," she whispered. Elijah held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Good." That one word hit her harder than praise. It sounded like permission to become the person she had almost failed to be. Down the concourse, hurried footsteps multiplied. Station managers, operations leads, legal, human resources. The invisible machinery of an airline had begun rushing toward Gate C-19 like blood toward a wound. And Vanessa, who had wanted this handled publicly, was about to learn what public really meant. The first to arrive was the airport station manager, a compact man named Gerald Pike, whose suit looked expensive enough to suggest rank but rumpled enough to suggest panic. He approached at speed, scanning faces until he found Elijah, and the color left him so quickly it was almost violent. "Mr. Ward," he said, breathless. I was told there had been a boarding irregularity." He used the phrase the way frightened executives always do when they want language to erase what happened before facts can pin it down. Elijah looked at him without rescuing him from the moment. "You were told incorrectly," he said. Gerald nodded too many times. Another manager appeared, then a woman from regional operations, then two people from corporate compliance who had likely been in the airport already by miserable coincidence. The gate became crowded with polished shoes, clipped apologies, and the smell of expensive cologne layered over institutional fear. Vanessa stood just outside their tightening circle, still in uniform, still trying not to look like she had orchestrated the entire disaster. "Sir," Gerald said carefully, "if you would allow us to escort you to the lounge while we resolve this." "No," Elijah said. Not harshly, just finally. The word halted everyone. He looked around the gate, at the passengers, the officers, the phones still raised. "She did this publicly," he said. "We'll address it publicly." Even the vlogger stopped whispering. That was the moment the story stopped being about one man reclaiming a seat and started becoming something far more dangerous to careless institutions. A reckoning with witnesses. Elijah stepped slightly aside so the officers, Maya, the older woman, and even the nearby passengers remained inside the circle of attention. "I want everyone who saw this to stay exactly where they are," he said, "including the employee who called security, including the employee who told the truth." Gerald looked like a man trapped between obeying his chairman and fearing what compliance would uncover. "Of course," he said. Vanessa finally found her voice. "Mr. Ward, if I had known who you were—" Elijah turned toward her. "That is the problem," he said. Silence, absolute silence. "If you had known who I was, I would have been treated correctly. Which means your professionalism depends on visible status." He let the sentence sit there in front of passengers, managers, officers, and cameras alike. "That is rot?" The older woman's eyes lowered briefly, as if in sorrow. Maya gripped the counter so hard her knuckles whitened. And the people who had once watched for entertainment were now watching something rarer. Truth spoken in the language institutions fear most their own. Vanessa's face had gone pale beneath the careful makeup, but she was still clinging to the last scraps of self-justification. "I was making a judgment call for the safety of the flight," she said. "Based on what?" Elijah asked. His documentation raised concern. Gerald interjected weakly, trying to absorb impact. Elijah looked at him. "Did it?" Gerald's mouth closed. Maya could have answered, but she didn't have to now. The evidence had outgrown her. The broad-shouldered officer stepped forward. "For the record," he said, professional and suddenly precise, the passenger was compliant at all times. Security was called under the description of a potentially disruptive refusal. That description does not match what we observed on arrival. It was a careful statement, but it stripped the last layer of cover from Vanessa's version. The younger officer added, "There are civilian recordings." At that, the vlogger raised her phone without apology. "Several," she said. Comments were streaming so fast across her screen that they looked like static. The older woman in the camel coat spoke next. "You asked me if procedure concerned me," she said to Vanessa. "What concerned me was recognizing disrespect dressed as policy. I've lived long enough to know the difference." Her voice was calm, but its dignity carried weight no corporate title could manufacture. Elijah's phone buzzed again, then again, then again. He finally looked at it. Board members. Chief legal. 2 vice presidents. A flood of messages, all sudden with urgency now that reality had names attached. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. There would be time for power later. Right now, he seemed intent on something more valuable, making everyone in that gate see exactly how ordinary the cruelty had been before they knew it might cost them something. A third flashback flickered through him then. Not childhood this time. 7 years earlier, at a conference in Seattle, he had entered through the service corridor because the main lobby was packed, only to be mistaken for maintenance and handed a trash bin by a speaker who later begged for investment. He remembered laughing privately at the irony, but he also remembered the hotel porter who whispered, "Happens all the time, sir," with the tired shame of someone used to seeing the world reveal itself. That was when Elijah began quietly auditing every company he touched, not just for revenue, but for dignity. Mystery shoppers, anonymous site visits, silent observations. He had learned something expensive people rarely understand. A business is not what it says on earnings calls. A business is what happens when the wrong person is watching and nobody knows it. At Gate C-19, under rain-streaked glass and fluorescent airport light, that philosophy had just landed in human form. The thing about large corporations is that they freeze not when one person gets hurt, but when evidence makes denial impossible. Within minutes, compliance had secured copies of passenger video. Airport CCTV had been requested, and regional operations had begun cross-checking the internal call logs that would show exactly who escalated what and when. Vanessa seemed to realize piece by piece that this was no longer a misunderstanding to apologize through. It was an event with timestamps. "Mr. Ward," said the regional operations director, a severe woman named Rena Keller who had arrived with legal in tow. "We'd like to move this to a private office for immediate review." "You keep trying to move it out of sight," Elijah replied. "Why?" nobody answered. Because everyone knew why. Privacy often arrives in institutions only after publicity makes accountability necessary. Elijah turned toward the passengers still clustered near the gate. "How many of you heard me raise my voice?" he asked. No hands. "How many of you saw me refuse instruction?" None. "How many of you watched me be treated like I did not belong before anyone established facts?" Several hands rose slowly. Then more. The visual of it seemed to strike even Gerald Pike with shame. The older woman did not raise her hand because she had become, by then, something more powerful than a witness. She had become conscience. "My late husband flew this airline for 32 years, she said softly. "He used to say the danger isn't one rude person. It's the system around them getting used to it." Elijah inclined his head to her, receiving the sentence as if it belonged in a boardroom report. The vlogger, still filming, whispered to her viewers, "This just turned into a master class." And Maya Young scared. Visibly shaken, Maya found herself staring at Elijah with a kind of disbelief that had nothing to do with his title. She had expected anger from powerful men. She had expected threats, ego, spectacle. What she was witnessing instead was surgical dignity. He was not trying to humiliate Vanessa. He was forcing the company to confront the condition that allowed her to think humiliation was acceptable when directed downward. "Delay the flight," Elijah said at last. Gerald hesitated. "Sir, there are hundreds of downstream connections." Elijah's gaze settled on him. "Delay the flight," he repeated. "If dignity can be disrupted by one employee's bias, then your schedule is not your highest priority tonight." Gerald nodded instantly. Within moments, the departure board updated, delayed, across the terminal, staff phones lit up. Crew systems flagged. Gate chatter surged. And somewhere far beyond C-19, executive offices began learning that the reason their aircraft had stopped moving was not mechanical, not weather-related but moral. Word travels unnaturally fast in places built on hierarchy. By the time the delay was officially coded into the network, airport staff from neighboring gates were already pretending not to look toward C-19 while absolutely looking toward C-19. A pilot from another flight slowed his stride. Two customer service agents whispered behind a kiosk. Someone from catering openly stared. The gate had become a gravity well. Vanessa stood off to one side now, no longer the center of motion but the object around which consequences were arranging themselves. Rena Keller requested her device logs. Compliance requested the incident chronology. Security reviewed the original call classification and confirmed it had overstated the threat level. Piece by piece, the elegant language of cover was breaking apart into blunt reality. She had profiled a passenger, invented an irregularity, escalated without cause, and attempted to justify the escalation after witnesses appeared. None of that required Elijah's title to be wrong. His title merely made the company unable to look away. The vlogger ended her livestream only long enough to save the recording and start a backup. She knew gold when she saw it, but for once there was something more than clicks in her face, a strange sense of responsibility. The older woman sat again, though she remained near the front, hands folded, posture straight. Maya had been moved from the desk while another agent took over late boarding communications. She stood with an HR representative now, giving a trembling account of the manifest checks and the false credential claim. Every time her voice shook, Elijah kept his eyes respectfully elsewhere, as though protecting her from the pressure of his attention. That too Maya would remember. Gerald received a call, listened, then approached Elijah with the careful stiffness of someone speaking on behalf of even more frightened people. "The CEO is on a secure line," he said. Elijah almost smiled, but it wasn't amusement. It was recognition. This was how institutions work when discomfort reaches the top. Suddenly every unavailable person is available. "Tell her I'll speak after witness statements are completed," he said. Gerald blinked. "Yes, sir." Around them, the flight crew had begun to absorb what was happening. A pilot appeared at the cockpit end of the jet bridge, saw the crowd, caught part of the explanation from a manager, and went still. A senior attendant from business class looked physically ill. They were all doing the same calculation. If this happened to the wrong man tonight, how many right people had it happened to before tonight without any chairman in plain clothes to expose it? That question hung in the air heavier than the rain outside, and it made the whole airline feel, for the first time, as fragile as it truly was. Eventually, after witnesses had spoken and recordings had been duplicated, Elijah allowed himself to be led a few feet away from the counter to take the CEO's call, though not far enough to turn the event into a private negotiation. He stood near the glass wall overlooking the runway, where red lights blinked through the rain and the tarmac shone like black water. His voice remained low, but close enough that fragments carried. "No," he said once. Then later, "This is not about me boarding." Then, after a pause long enough to suggest someone on the other end was trying to contain damage with vocabulary, he said, "You are still speaking as though optics are the injury." That line traveled through the people nearest him like an electric current. When he ended the call, Gerald stepped forward at once. "Will you still be flying tonight, sir?" Elijah looked at the delayed aircraft, then at Vanessa, then at the passengers whose evening had been turned into witness duty. "Yes," he said. "But not until every passenger at this gate understands what caused the delay." Gerald paled again. A public explanation? A truthful one. So Gerald did it. Under the sterile hum of gate lighting and the restless shuffle of travelers trying to catch fragments, he picked up the microphone and delivered the most uncomfortable announcement of his career. He did not name Vanessa, but he stated clearly that the delay had been caused by an internal handling failure involving the improper challenge of a ticketed passenger, whose credentials were valid, and that the company was conducting an immediate review. Gasps moved in waves. Some passengers looked at Vanessa openly now, with the naked contempt that social shame produces faster than official discipline. The hedge fund man, who had earlier seemed annoyed by delay, now looked embarrassed to have shared the same line without speaking up sooner. The older woman closed her eyes briefly, perhaps in relief, perhaps in exhaustion. The vlogger captured the entire announcement, her camera steady. Maya stared at the floor and cried quietly, not because the truth had become public, but because it had taken this much force to make public truth possible. Elijah noticed, and after the announcement ended, he crossed to her. "You did well," he said softly. Maya covered her mouth, nodded, and turned away so she could breathe. In that small act of mercy, more than in any executive order, the people around him began to understand that his power was not hidden in his title. It was hidden in what he chose not to use unless necessary. Then came the part no one at the gate had expected. Elijah asked to see the training records. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not after a committee. Right then. Compliance scrambled, HR objected, legal advised caution, and Elijah overruled all of it with the kind of quiet authority that does not need volume because it is structurally real. Within 12 minutes, records were being pulled from internal systems on secure tablets. Vanessa's recent evaluations came first: strong punctuality, high procedural adherence, repeated commendations for controlling boarding flow, but tucked in. Employee notes were 2 prior customer concerns involving tone, 1 unfiled supervisor observation about status-driven deference patterns, and a coaching recommendation that had been marked complete without any attached follow-up. Elijah scrolled in silence. Rena Keller's expression hardened as she read over his shoulder. This was knowable, Elijah said. Nobody rushed to disagree. Maya, standing several feet away, heard the sentence and felt it enter her like a blade. Because that was the real horror of institutions, wasn't it? Not always that evil hid well, but that it often didn't hide at all. It just sat in records until someone important enough got hurt. Vanessa looked smaller now, but still not remorseful in the way true remorse requires. She seemed frightened for herself, not pierced by what she had done. I've handled thousands of passengers, she said suddenly, as though sheer volume might dilute responsibility. Elijah looked up. And how many received your best behavior only because they wore it visibly? She had no answer. The older woman in the camel coat finally spoke again. The shame of prejudice, she said, is not that it misreads wealth, it's that it misreads worth. The sentence settled into the moment like scripture. Even legal said nothing. Outside, another aircraft pushed back from a neighboring gate, engines rising in a low mechanical roar that vibrated faintly through the glass. Yet Flight 718 remained still, a full aircraft and an entire crew pinned in place not by weather but by the cost of disrespect. Elijah handed the tablet back to Rena. Pending full review, he said. Remove her from duty immediately. Vanessa inhaled sharply. You can't do this over one misunderstanding. Elijah held her gaze with something colder than anger. I'm not doing this over a misunderstanding, he said. I'm doing this over a demonstrated pattern, witnessed live, escalated falsely, documented independently and defended dishonestly. HR moved then. Not dramatically. No handcuffs. No shouting. Just the soft bureaucratic language of administrative removal. Yet somehow that quietness made it harsher. Vanessa's badge was requested, her device surrendered, her access suspended, and every person in that gate understood that the freeze spreading through the airline had begun with one assumption about a man in a plain sweater. By the time boarding resumed, the story had already escaped the gate. The vlogger's clip, edited only by the raw speed of attention, was moving across social platforms with captions like, "Airline staff targets quiet passenger, then learns who he really is, and this is why people film everything." But the virality that mattered most was internal. Regional presidents were messaging each other. Training departments were being asked for escalation statistics. Customer experience leaders were suddenly interested in patterns they had once filed under isolated incidents. In the cabin, passengers settled differently than before. People spoke in lowered voices. The energy had changed from luxury impatience to collective aftermath. Elijah was invited to pre-board again, this time with enough nervous deference to embarrass almost anyone. He declined. "I'll board with everyone else," he said. So he did, walking down the jet bridge carrying his old leather bag while people stepped aside, not because he demanded it, but because they had finally learned to see him. As he entered the aircraft, a different flight attendant, a woman with tired but sincere eyes named Renee, met him at the door. "Mr. Ward," she said, voice unsteady, "I'm sorry for what happened at the gate." Elijah answered with the same disciplined grace that had defined the night. Then make sure the next person doesn't need my name for that apology, he said. She nodded as if the words landed somewhere permanent. In first class, passengers who had earlier watched with curiosity now watched with respect edged by self-reproach. The hedge fund man rose awkwardly to let Elijah into the window seat and muttered, "Should have said something sooner." Elijah gave him a brief glance. "Next time, do." That line would stay with him long after the flight. The older woman in the camel coat, seated across the aisle now, smiled faintly as she fastened her belt. "My husband would have liked you," she said. Elijah's face softened for the first time that night. "I think I would have liked him too," he said. Near the galley, Maya had been reassigned to paperwork but was allowed to board later on a deadhead seat after Rena personally authorized it. When she entered and passed first class, Elijah gave her the smallest nod. It was enough. She sat down farther back with tears burning behind her eyes, understanding that one night can alter the moral direction of a career if you let it. The cabin lights dimmed for departure. Rain ticked softly against the fuselage. Yet before the plane could move, one final thing had to happen. The captain's voice came over the speaker, warm but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mark Ellison from the flight deck. Before we depart, I want to acknowledge the delay this evening. While we cannot discuss personnel matters in detail, I can say clearly that every passenger deserves to be treated with fairness and respect from the moment they reach our gate. On behalf of this crew, I apologize." There was no applause, no cinematic cheer, just a deep human exhale moving quietly through the cabin. It felt more real than applause would have. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, and as the engines began their low, rising whine, Elijah looked out the window at the wet lights of the terminal slipping away. There was a peculiar loneliness in his face then, one the passengers around him could not fully understand. Because moments like this are satisfying to witnesses, but for the person at the center, they often carry grief too, the grief of knowing how close cruelty always is to ordinary life, and how many people never receive justice dramatic enough to expose it. As the plane taxied, Elijah's phone filled with incoming statements, alerts, and calls he still would not take. He instead opened a notes app and typed 3 words, "Gate Behavior Audit." Then beneath it, Anonymous Travel Review Expansion. This was how his mind worked. Not revenge first, repair. Across the aisle, the older woman watched him and seemed to know that. "You're not done?" she said quietly once the engine steadied. Elijah looked over. "No," he answered. This was one gate. She nodded as though confirming something she had already sensed. "Good." Meanwhile, farther back, Maya checked her own inbox and found a message from corporate HR requesting a formal protected statement, along with assurance that retaliation safeguards were being activated immediately. She stared at the screen in disbelief. Maybe they meant it. Maybe they only meant it tonight because the wrong man got stopped. She didn't know, but she knew something had cracked open. And on the ground, before the aircraft had even reached takeoff speed, Rena Keller had already ordered a full review of escalation calls over the last 18 months, disaggregated by cabin class, appearance-based complaint origin, and discretionary document checks. Numbers would soon tell a story long ignored. The airline was freezing, yes, but not from fear alone. It was freezing the way a body freezes when it suddenly understands where the infection has been dot by the time Flight 718 reached cruising altitude above the storm. The story had become larger than any one gate could hold. News blogs were picking up clips. Corporate PR was drafting statements. Legal was advising restraint. Board members were demanding timelines. But inside the cabin, the night grew unexpectedly human. Meal service began late and subdued. Glassware glimmered under soft lighting. The usual polished choreography of premium travel returned, though more carefully now, as if everyone on board understood that performance without principle had been the entire problem. Renee served Elijah first, hands still slightly nervous. "Can I bring you anything extra?" she asked. "Water's fine," he said. Across the aisle, the older woman introduced herself at last. Dr. Lorraine Bell, retired history professor, widow of a commercial pilot, grandmother of 4, witness by habit. They spoke softly over untouched warm nuts and folded linens. And in that conversation, pieces of Elijah appeared that no title could show. He had built his first logistics route mapping tool from a storage unit and 2 second-hand servers. He still carried the same bag because his mother bought it for him when his company first turned a profit. He flew without entourage whenever he wanted to understand what companies actually felt like from the inside. "You inspect the soul, not the numbers," Dr. Bell said. Elijah smiled faintly. "I try to." A few rows back, the hedge fund man kept replaying the night in his head, feeling the acidic regret of comfortable silence. The vlogger, now off camera, drafted a caption she hoped would do the moment justice without turning it into cheap spectacle. Maya sat in her deadhead seat reading and rereading her HR protections, trying to imagine going back to work after tonight without shrinking again. She thought about the moment Elijah had asked whether she spoke because he was chairman or because it was true. She realized that question would follow her into every room for the rest of her life. Somewhere over Pennsylvania, while the cabin dimmed and engines hummed like distant weather, Elijah finally called his chief of staff. "Start with discretionary stops at boarding," he said. "Then station-level coaching closures. Then prior witness statements if any exist, quietly." He listened, then added, "No, I don't want a polished memo by morning. I want raw patterns." When he ended the call, he looked exhausted in a way success never cures. Outside the window, there was only darkness and scattered city light beneath clouds. Inside, justice had happened, but justice was only the first floor of what he was building now. The landing in New York was smooth, the kind where wheels kiss runway so lightly the cabin almost doubts impact until reverse thrust hums through the floor. At the gate, passengers gathered bags in the familiar choreography of travel's final impatience, but no one surged ahead of Elijah. Several looked at him, then away, each carrying some private version of the lesson. Dr. Bell touched his sleeve before standing. "Thank you," she said. Elijah shook his head gently. "For what?" "For not wasting this on ego." He held her gaze for a second, then answered with quiet honesty. "I've had enough people do that already." They shared the kind of smile strangers sometimes earn only after weathering something true together. Maya waited until most passengers had deplaned before stepping into the aisle. She didn't know if she should approach him. In the end, Elijah made the decision for her by pausing near the galley. "You may not believe this tonight," he said, "but fear can teach clarity if you don't let it teach obedience instead." Maya nodded, unable to speak. "And Maya?" She looked up. "Keep records." It sounded practical, almost dry, but she understood the gift inside it. Not cynicism, strategy, down in the terminal. Black SUVs and executives waited with the frantic efficiency of corporations trying to catch up with conscience. Elijah ignored most of them. He spoke briefly with Rena, instructed her to include customer witnesses in the review process, and requested that Dr. Bell be contacted personally with thanks and travel credit not as a payoff, but as recognition for intervening when many would not. Vanessa, he was informed, had been placed on immediate suspension pending termination review, and the security call had been formally recategorized as false escalation. Press inquiries were rising. Internal morale channels were erupting. Flight attendants' unions were already bracing. "Good," Elijah said when told the story was spreading fast. Gerald blinked. "Good, sir?" Elijah looked back toward the gate where the night had begun. "Sunlight is expensive," he said, "but mold hates it." Those nearby fell silent. In one sentence he had explained the freeze more clearly than any press release ever could. This was not a scandal to be contained. It was evidence to be used. And as he finally walked toward the exit, still carrying the same old leather bag, still looking like a man most people would underestimate in a crowd, the people who watched him go understood something that had nothing to do with first class, titles, or billion-dollar holdings. Real power had passed through that airport in plain clothes and asked not to be admired, only not to be lied to. By sunrise, the airline had issued its first statement. By noon, it had announced an external review of customer handling protocols, discretionary document checks, and escalation procedures across all major hubs. By the end of the week, Vanessa Cole was gone. 2 supervisors were under investigation for closing coaching notes without follow-up, and Gate C-19 had become a case study inside an emergency ethics briefing no one in leadership could pretend was optional anymore. Maya Torres was placed on a protected advancement track under operations compliance. Dr. Lorraine Bell received a handwritten letter from Elijah, not because she had defended the chairman of an airline group, but because she had defended a stranger before she knew he mattered to anyone with power. The vlogger's video crossed 10 million views, though the clip people returned to most was not the reveal of Elijah's name. It was the moment he said, "That is the problem." Because that was the wound at the center of everything. Professionalism that appears only when status is visible is not professionalism at all. Weeks later, Elijah sat in a boardroom reviewing raw findings from the audit he had triggered that night. Patterns emerged exactly where he expected them to: more secondary checks for passengers who looked less affluent, more discretionary confrontations when class markers were absent, more unchallenged tone complaints from staff who were efficient but not equitable. He did not smile when he saw the proof. Vindication has very little joy when it confirms what your life already taught you. He approved a new silent travel review program, mandatory intervention training, protected witness channels for junior staff, and real-time escalation audits that no local manager could bury. He did it not because he had been insulted in public, but because too many others had been, and no camera had saved them. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: the most dangerous kind of arrogance is not loud wealth or open hatred. It is ordinary authority, convinced it can tell who deserves dignity by looking. Elijah Ward never needed that seat to prove his worth. Vanessa needed his plain clothes to reveal her own. And when the truth came, it did what truth always does when someone finally refuses to hide it. It froze the machinery long enough for people to see what had been running underneath. If you've ever watched someone be judged before they were known, or stayed silent and wished later that you hadn't, tell me in the comments. And if stories like this remind you why quiet strength matters more than loud status, like, subscribe and stay with Eco Story for the next one.